Most guitar players think music theory is about memorizing scales, modes and confusing rules. Here's the truth. None of that stuff actually matters at all unless you can really use it when you're playing. In this video, I'm going to demystify the fundamental areas of music theory that you need once and for all so that you can actually apply it to your playing. You'll finally see the benefits of theory and understand that why knowledge is power. So let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk to you about is that most guitar players have come across the major scale being a series of tones and semitones. And when I'm teaching guitar and people come to me for a lesson, of which if you're interested in all of that stuff, the links are in the description box below. When people turn up for a guitar lesson, they can usually recite to me that the major scale was built up on a series of tones and semitones and all of that stuff. But what they can't do is apply that to their fretboard so that it actually means something in the real world. Now, the easiest way to see a scale on the guitar is to look at it on a single string. So what's written on the screen in front of you now in the diagram form is the C major scale, but being played along the length of the 5th string. So I'm starting this at a C, 3rd fret on my 5th string, and what I'm doing is passing through the notes of the scale, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. But what you can now see is that pattern of tone. So from C to D is your tone, D to E is another tone, then from E to F is a semitone, F to G is tone, G to A is a tone, A to B is a tone, and then finally B back to the C, our root note, is another semitone. Now, most music theory is easy to understand on the piano because the piano is laid out all in front of you and you can see things moving around like this. Guitar is easier to see these patterns of things like tones and semitones in that straight line. So what I'm going to do is go back to that and then I'm going to start experimenting with it. What's very important in terms of applying this stuff is that you have a backing track that you can play against. Now, what I've just set up on this track here is a C major 7 chord that is then going to an F major 7 chord, okay? Now, these two chords in conjunction, they set up the sound of C major nicely. So I've got my C major 7 and an F major 7. Now, in this key, we're going to talk about chords in the key in a moment. But an F major 7 is the 4 chord in the key. Now, as this progression goes by, what happens is your residual memory, your residual ear wants this to be pulling back to the notes of C. So this makes a wonderful backdrop for us to experiment the sounds of the C major scale. So if I play this from the C, we've got C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and I can work back down again. So if you just take a scale like this and play it in a line and just work your way up and down, what this would be really great for is educating your ear, okay? And it will be very, very good for educating your ear on the power of intervals. Now, when I'm talking about intervals are basically the distance between two different notes. So if we take our C as the root note of this scale, and then we look at the next note along, which is a D, that note is what we call a major second, okay? So because we're in the major scale, we're going up to the second note of the scale, major second. Now what's really, really important here is to hear what a major second sounds like against the root. So if you just go C, D, C, D, C, D, C, you're starting to develop an ear for what those intervals sound like in single note melodies, so that when you're improvising and soloing, you can start using these intervals. So I would do the same thing with C and E. Now this is what we call a major third, okay, C to E, because it's the third note of the major scale. Okay, now another way that you can also do this, because these things are going to start getting a bit stretchy, you can play these notes on a different string. So if I could take my E from the 7th fret on my A string, move it over to the 2nd fret, should I say, on my D string, I can now play C, E, major third. Okay, the next one I've got is the C to F. Now this is what we call a perfect fourth. Now the reason we call it a perfect fourth is because when we play these two notes together like this, it's a very consonant interval, so there's no dissonance, there's no clash, okay? So if I take a C somewhere else on the guitar, this one maybe, and I play a D alongside it, it's a very dissonant interval, okay? But if I'm playing a perfect fourth, C to an F, it's a very consonant interval. So many of you will recognise the sound of fourths from this famous riff. So they're fourths. Now the inversion of fourths is actually a power chord, which is a fifth. Now we're going to talk about fifths here. Because if I now play my C and a G, which in a straight line looks like this, if I move that to here, a fifth is a power chord. Okay, and then we've got the C to an A. Now in this case this will be a major 6. Okay, I could play my C to my B. Or if I play that in a position like this. So I'm going from 3rd fret on the 5th string over to the 4th fret on the G string to play the B. So that's our major 7, and then finally C to C. That's what we call an octave. Now, so when you have your octave, what you've done there are 12 chromatic notes in an octave, because there's 12 notes in Western music theory. But what we're basically saying is we've passed through all of the notes of our major scale and we're getting back to our root. Hence it's called the octave, okay? So what I would suggest that you do at this point is start having backing tracks like the one that I've done here. You could just highlight purely the C major 7 chord itself. So I've now highlighted that one chord so that it's not going to go to the F. And now what I can do is I can experiment with all of those notes against that C and decide for myself what I think to the sound, okay? So I could do the C to D. Now to my ear, that sounds like it either wants to go home or wants to progress up to the next note. So again, when I hear this, the major third is a very stable note, C to E. Or if I wanted to play it like that. Okay, so let's now play the 4th. Now that one is not, although it's a consonant interval, it feels to me like it either wants to pull back to that 3rd or progress to up to the 5th. Now many of you will have probably played a suspended chord. So if I play a C major chord, now if I suspend the major 3rd, so I'm playing that 4th, it feels like it wants to go back to there. So that's the thing about fourths. It's a valid note in the scale, but it's one that you need to treat with care because it probably wants to go back to that 3rd or go up to that 5th. Okay, so now we need to play the 6th, C to A. Here, C to A. Again, that's quite a stable, nice sounding sweet interval, a bit like a 3rd. Like it wants to pull back to that 5th, and then we've got our major 7, which is a very unstable note because of course that really wants to go to that root. Okay, but experimenting with your scales in that way, so you're playing them in a straight line or extracting those intervals from a position and playing them against the backing is how you can educate your ear on what they all sound like. Now, all of those intervals can also be altered. So, for example, if I'm playing my second, that can be flattened to become a flat 2. So anyone who's ever seen the Jaws movie, that's that sort of very harrowing, scary sound that a minor second or a flat second has. Also, anyone who's into metal will know that sound because it's in like many metal tunes. So of course you can flatten your third as well, and that will give you a minor third. So instead of major, we're going to get... Now we all pretty much know that one because it's the sound of our sort of old favourite blues guitar scale. Fourths, again, well, there is one scale out there where you see a flat 4, or one scale that comes to mind for me anyway. There might be many more exotic modes, but the Super Locrian mode that has a flat 4. A flat 4 would be almost the same thing as a major third. But generally, when a fourth gets altered, it gets augmented, which means it gets raised by a semitone. And that is something that's very prevalent in one of the modes of the major scale that we'll talk about in a bit, called the Lydian mode. You can have a flat 5, so if I take my C to G, I could lower that, and that's the same, it's sort of the same as our sharp 4. But if I go from this, I now feel it's functioning more as a flat 5 than a sharp 4. So if you're taking a fifth and then flattening it, that's of course what we call a diminished fifth. If you're taking a fourth and then raising it, it's an augmented fourth. Okay. Then we've got our sixth. You can flatten your sixth. Now again, that will be very similar to a fifth that's being raised. So an augmented fifth and a flat sixth are fairly the same thing. And then lastly, your 7, which in our case here, we've got a major 7. If we lower that a semitone, we get a flat 7. Now, all of these different intervals are all used in conjunction to make up different chord types and different scales and all of that stuff. But what you have to understand with theory is that the major scale itself is the most important in Western music. So everything is judged against the major scale. So what we've seen here with C major, the notes of course were C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Intervallically we had root, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major 6, major 7, back to the root. So any other time that a scale has different formulas to that, where they're basically taking those intervals of the major scale and altering them, either by flattening them or sharpening them. What I want to talk about next here is changing key. So another problem that I see a lot of guitar players have with theory is they learn everything in C major because C major is easy to understand, but then they don't necessarily apply that to different scales and different keys. So what we're going to look at here is the A major scale being played along the length of a single string. So the A major scale contains the notes A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, back to A. Now in terms of formula, it's exactly the same as what we had in C. Okay, we now have an A as the root note, B is a major second relative to A, C sharp is the major third relative to A, then we've got our D, which is your perfect fourth relative to A, we have an E, which is a perfect fifth relative to A, we have F sharp, which is the major 6, we've then got a G sharp, which is the major 7 relative to A, and then finally your octave. Okay, so formulas for scales is very important that we understand that they are transferable. Okay, so the formula for the C major scale was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, back to 1. The formula for the major scale in the key of A will be exactly the same, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, back to 1. But those intervals, the actual notes, they will change dependent on the key. So it's very important that you understand that the intervallic distance from whatever your root note is, of say a major third or a second or fourth, they're consistent, but the actual name of the notes will change. As we're going through this stuff here, this might be throwing up all sorts of questions for you that you want to ask. If you do go to the links in my description box below, you can see about how you can get involved with taking a lesson with me. Or I also have a free course available that you can watch through, pay plenty of attention to that, and that will provide plenty more answers than I can do here on YouTube. Next thing that I want to talk about is harmonizing the scale. Again, over time when I've been teaching for about 20 years now, I've been teaching the guitar, and most people that I see, if they understand the tone and semitone thing about scales and those kind of things, they haven't gone through and really understood what this section here is about harmonizing a scale. And this is really important. So this is about how we create the chords from the intervals within that scale. And basically how this works is you're going to look at stacking thirds, okay? So on the diagram here you can see I've got a root note, number 1 of the major scale. So these numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, they represent the major scale. So this would work in absolutely any key, okay? What you do from your root note is you would skip over the second degree and go to the third. Once you've got that note, you skip over the fourth and go to the fifth. So that's what we mean by stacking thirds. Go from root to the third, from the third to the fifth. So we'll extract those 3 notes from the major scale to create a chord. So if I do that with you right now, if we take our C major scale, okay, and we extract from that the C, and then we also extract the E, because that's our major third. We skip across the D and take out the E, and then we're going to skip out the fourth and then go to a G. Those 3 notes put together, C, E, G, they create what we call a C major triad, or a C major chord. Now most of you watching this video will probably know how to play this. So that's your C major chord, and that's how it's constructed. Now, of course, if you watch some of my other content, or if you don't know this yet, this is something that is very, very important, is you want to be able to apply these chord forms into the caged system, because that's how you can see the chords all over the whole neck, and they basically provide your scaffold for which you can then build all your pentatonic shapes, all your triads, all of your arpeggios, all of your other soloing tools. So what that means is I've got a C chord that I can play here, but because of the virtues of the cage system, I can also play it here, I can also play it here, I can also play it here, and I can also play it here. So once you've got your chords all over the whole guitar neck, and then you also adorn those chords with other information, like I say, your major scales, your pentatonic scales, your arpeggios and things like that, you start to build up a really good picture of the fretboard. And then once you can turn that, like work on your technique and develop your vocabulary, you can basically play whatever you want. Again, if you want more help with all of that stuff, go to the links in the description. So stacking the thirds from C gave us the C, E and G, which is our C major chord, as we discussed here. So what we would now want to do is start stacking those thirds from every point within the scale, okay? So what you can see on the screen in front of you now is if I start at a D and then skip over the E to the F and then skip over from the F to the A, I get these 3 notes. So what I'm doing, what we did on the starting from C, we skipped over from C to E to G. Now if I start on the D, instead of going straight through like this, I'm skipping over again, extracting the third. So I've got D, F, and A. Now if I play those positionally, D, F, A, you can hopefully hear that that sounds like it's minor. So if I play those 3 notes as a chord, it gives me a D minor chord. Okay. What you would now want to do is repeat that process for every note in the scale, and this is something that's consistent across all keys. Okay, so any major scale can be harmonized this way, but in C, once you've harmonized it this way, what it gives us is a C major chord starting from the root. Then on the second degree we get a D minor. On the third degree we get an E minor. On 4th degree we get an F major. 5th degree gives us G major. The 6th degree gives us A minor. And then lastly, the 7th degree gives us B diminished. And then that needs to resolve to a C again, okay? So that's the C major scale harmonized in triads. Now, because the scale is constructed from a formula that is transposable to the other keys, we can now take our A major scale, which was the second scale that I talked to you guys about here, and we can apply that to A major. So if we stack thirds from an A, I get A, C sharp, and E, which is my A major chord or A major triad. And then if we were to continue stacking thirds, otherwise known as playing every other note in the scale, from each note of the scale, we get the following chords. So we'd have A major, B minor, C sharp minor, D major, E major, F sharp minor, G sharp diminished, and then back to A major. As you can see, the pattern of triads and chords that we create when we harmonize the scale in that way is completely consistent. So in any major key, you would have the same pattern of triads and chords that you can create by harmonizing your scale. Now, triads are only part of the equation, so the next thing that we want to talk about here is 4-part chords. 4-part chords are 7th chords, okay? So what we're going to be looking at here is harmonizing in 7ths. Now, we create 7th chords by stacking another third on top of the triad. So if we do that in the diagram, you can see here that we've got C as our root note. We're skipping over to the E as the major third. We're then skipping over to the G as the perfect fifth. And then finally, we would skip over one more to give us the major 7 in this case. So this is C, E, G, B. So if I play those notes, C, E, G, B. Okay, so when a lot of students look at this sort of stuff and they go, what does the 7 mean? They start to get a bit scared because of the numbers. That's all it means. It means that we've gone up from playing a triad to adding the 7th degree relative to that root note. So C major 7 sounds like this. What we'd want to do next is apply that same sort of thinking to our D minor. So we had a D minor triad. So what we had, we went from the D to the F to the A. Now the next note in the scale would be a B, but as we're skipping, playing every other note, stacking the thirds, the next note would be a C. So from D minor, to play a 4-part harmony or a 7th chord, we would go D, F, A, C. Now what that gives us is a D minor 7. Now again, we would play through the scale in exactly the same way, stacking the thirds from every note in that scale. So what this actually gives us, if you look again at the diagram that's on the screen, you can see that on the first degree of the scale, we end up with a C major 7. On the second degree of the scale, we end up with a D minor 7. Then on the third degree, we end up with E minor 7. On the 4th degree, we have F major 7. On the 5th degree, we have G dominant 7, which we'll come to in a minute. We'll have a look at those. We've then got A minor 7 on the 6th degree. And then finally on the 7th degree, we've got B minor 7 flat 5. Back to our C major 7. Dominant 7 and the minor 7 flat 5 chord may seem like an anomaly to you at this point, so they're going to need a bit more explaining. So what we've done when we played through our C major and we stacked the thirds, we ended up with, relative to a C, we had an E, which is a major third relative to C. We then had a G, which is a perfect fifth, and then we had a B, which is a major 7 relative to C. And then that gave us this chord. When we did this from D, D gave us F, which is a minor third relative to the D. It also gave us an A, which is a perfect fifth relative to D, and then it gave us a C, which is a minor 7 relative to D. So that intervallic makeup, root, minor third, fifth, flat 7. That's what we class as a minor 7 chord, okay? So then on E we had the same thing. So with E you've got E, G, B and D. Those notes make a minor 7 chord. From F you've got F, A, which is a major third relative to F. You've got C, which is the perfect fifth relative to F. And we've also got E, which is major 7 relative to F. Now when we went up to G, G actually has a root, then the major third, a B is a major third relative to G. You've got D, which is the perfect fifth, but we have an F, which relative to G, F is a flat 7. So that gives us a chord that has root, third, fifth, flat 7. Now that's the formula for a dominant 7th chord. That's why some people who were looking at this, they would imagine because G was a major triad, they'd expect it to be a major 7 chord. And that's not true because G has a flat 7 in this case. Now on the B, B was a diminished triad. So a lot of students, when I'm talking to them about theory, they expect that it will be a diminished 7th, which isn't true. So when we look at this, let's have a look at from B. If we're stacking the thirds, we get a D, which is a minor third. We've then got an F, which is the flat 5 of B. We've then got an A, which is a flat 7 relative to B. So what we actually have is root, flat 3, flat 5, flat 7. Now formulaically that chord is what we call a minor 7 with a flattened 5. To become a diminished 7, this chord would actually need a double flat 7, okay? So this chord in the key of C, B minor 7 flat 5. And this is, again, this is consistent against all major scales. So let's now have a summary of the triads and 7th chords that live within any major scale. What we can say is that in any major key we will always have the following triads. The 1 chord will be major, the 2 chord will be minor, the 3 chord will be minor, your 4 chord is major, the 5 chord is major, your 6 chord is minor, and your 7th chord or triad will be diminished. Okay, but we will also have the following 7th chord types. So in any major key, the 1 chord is a major 7, the 2 chord is a minor 7, the 3 chord is a minor 7, the 4 chord is a major 7, the 5 chord is a dominant 7, the 6 chord is a minor 7, and the 7th chord will be a minor 7 flat 5. In terms of how you apply that to your fretboard, you absolutely want to know and learn the caged system, because then you've got 5 positions of each chord that you can use from a rhythm guitar perspective. There's way more ways that you can learn these chords across the guitar. There's all sorts of inversions. You have drop 2 inversions, you have drop 3 and 4, like there's all different types of jazz chord inversions. But as someone who's a rock player, and most of my audience is going to come from a rock background, if you learn the cage system, you have a few fundamental chord voicings that you'll probably ever need. But the other real advantage to learning those chords to the cage system is that you will then be able to adorn the chords with their arpeggio, triad types, and all of the rest of it. So something that's very interesting to look at is how you can use these triads and arpeggios as a soloist. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a 3 notes per string shape of C major, which will look like this. So I'm playing shape 2 of 3 notes per string, but what I'm doing is I'm resolving it to the root of the scale. Now the reason I want to use this particular shape is, what I'm going to do, by playing every other note of that scale shape, what I can do is extract all of the triads that we've just been talking about. So I'm going to start on a G here, and if I play every other note, what happens is I'm actually playing a C major triad, because this note here is a C, so this is a C major triad. Now if I carry on playing that shape in exactly the same fashion, if I play from an F, I've then got my B diminished triad. Then if I go to from an E here, I end up with an A minor triad. Now if you do that all the way through that entire shape, just playing every other note, you can extract all of those triads and you can use that over something like the C major backing track that I showed you earlier. So instead of be just running up and down the scale like this, you can actually end up playing a very rich harmonic area that you can add rhythmic interest and you can phrase around with it and all sorts of stuff. But instead of playing this, where you're playing straight through a scale, you're getting these interesting harmonic leaps. Let's have a listen to that against the backing track. Just one of a myriad of ways that you can use these in a lead guitar context. And another thing is that if we were to have a look at the arpeggios, you can do that in exactly the same way, but a different way that I like to use the arpeggios is to stack them in fourths. So if I was to play this, so basically starting from that G, where I had the C as a triad, if I keep going down one more note, that is actually giving me my A minor 7 seventh arpeggio. Now by going a fourth, what I mean by that is if I start on the B string, what this will give me, so if I carry on that from the G string as well, that will give me my B minor 7 flat 5, and then again if I do it from the D string, that will give me my F, and then I can just resolve that to the C or whatever if I want to. So let's now have a listen to these seventh arpeggios stacked in fourths against the C major backing. Very important for you to remember that all of this theory and looking at the chords and the triads and stuff like that, they're not just rhythm guitar concepts, they're very, very important lead guitar concepts, and you really want to have them down because most guitar players get stuck in just playing pentatonic scales and basic shapes, and the triads and the arpeggios provide you this absolutely huge, rich harmonic area to explore to really expand your lead playing. So while we're going down that rabbit hole, the next thing that I want to talk about is extensions, okay? So a lot of people will get to the whole thing about learning seventh chords and arpeggios and things like that. And then the next big question they have is, so why am I seeing things like ninths and 11ths and 13ths? So what I've done here is I've changed the perspective that we're looking at our C major scale from. So what I've done is I've made G the root note, okay? Now this is something that we're going to cover again in a moment, which is about modes, okay? But if I've now made G the root note, we're looking at this from the perspective of creating our G7 chord that we had a minute ago. So if I've got G as the root, when we skip over, the third of G is a B, the fifth of G is a D, the F is your flat 7, okay, so that gave us a G dominant seventh chord. Okay, now what we can do is if we go into the next octave and keep stacking these thirds, I'll end up with an A and a C and an E. And these notes relative to G are the ninth, so that's a major second up an octave. The 11th, that's the perfect fourth up an octave. And then your 13th is a sixth up an octave, okay? So now, by looking at continuing to stack these intervals into that second octave, that's where you end up at your extensions. So if we were playing a chord that just had G, B, D, F and A, that would be a G dominant 9. If we had everything up to there, including the C, that would be a G dominant 11. And then finally, if we add the E, that's a G dominant 13. Now, as a guitar player, you don't actually need to play all of your notes. You can kick certain notes out because, of course, we've only got 6 strings. So what we tend to do as a guitar player is cherry pick the notes that we want for our sounds, for the chord voicings. But also from a soloist's perspective, what you would do if you wanted to play a sound that was like a G dominant 9, what you would do is you'd play the arpeggio, but what you would do is you'd almost create effectively a pentatonic scale where you add the 9th to it. So you'd add the 2 right off the bat, so you could go root, 2, 3, 5, flat 7. That actually also gets referred to as the dominant pentatonic scale because, of course, we've added an extra note to an arpeggio, so we've now got a 5-note entity. Now, I don't want to get into too much explanation of all of that stuff here because this video could go on forever. So if you're keen to explore the extensions and exotic scales and all of the various other things that you could use, do check out the links in the description. Just quickly to round out talking about extensions, what we should look at is the summary of all of the extensions that you could ever possibly come across in your major scale. So if you're looking at major scale harmony, your 1 chord, which is major 7, could be extended by a 9, an 11 or a 13. The 2 chord as minor 7 could be minor 9, minor 11 or minor 13. The extensions for your 3 minor chord could be a flat 9, an 11 or a flat 13, which is basically a Phrygian chord, so it will have a flat 9 and a flat 13. We'll be talking about modes in a minute, so if that doesn't make sense, hang on and I'll clear that up for you in a second. So your 4 chord, that could have a 9, a sharp 11 or a 13, again because it's a Lydian chord, and we'll be getting to that in a minute. The 5 chord, which is dominant 7, could be dominant 9, dominant 11 or dominant 13. Your minor 7 on the 6 chord could be minor 9, minor 11 or have a flat 13. And the 7th chord, which is minor 7 flat 5, could have a flat 9, an 11 or a flat 13. All from within the major scale, okay? All of these extensions belong exclusively to the major scale. There are other scales to explore, things like melodic minor, harmonic minor. There's all sorts of exotic scales and all the rest of it. But as I said, this video is about the fundamentals of theory and harmony. That's what we're covering here. If you do want to learn about more exotic scales and things like that, check out the links in the description.